The Vision to Action Symposium series on sustainability in the built environment is an ongoing series of regional conferences that facilitate provocative, strategic conversations around bold, visionary initiatives gaining momentum in specific regions of the Pacific Northwest.
The following presentation is from the March 5, 2015 Vision to Action Symposium at the University of Washington, Tacoma. The topic was Adapting to Low-Impact Development, the New World of Stormwater Management. In this video, Sean Comfort, principal at AHBL Engineering based in Tacoma, shares a case study of SEHMEL Homestead Park, a recreational facility developed for Pierce County, which included significant set-aside of natural areas combined with extensive bioretention and permeable pavement to treat all stormwater on site. He draws important lessons for developers in working with regulators. To see all 9 videos in this series, visit www.visiontoaction.us.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sean Comfort with AHBL, one of the principal civil engineers in the company. Pardon me, I'm getting over a cold. Our firm has been involved in LAD projects for probably close to 16 plus years. They varied, a few in Pierce County, a few within the city of Tacoma, some other jurisdictions. And I can tell you from experience that what you're being told today, there's a lot of great points in reference to just the collaboration, the communication that needs to take place between applicant and stakeholders. And I'll cover that a little more today. I also tell you that I don't think this process is necessarily nuclear science either. There's a lot of common sense that goes into this process, and I think we've had very successful projects where we bring all the stakeholders in early and work with a group in a very proactive way to get the projects where they need to be. And we've done LAD projects on the private and public side, so they both have their process, but much of it's very similar. So today what we thought we'd do is take you for a walk in the park. So SEHMEL Homestead Park is a public project we worked on with Pierce County. Project was constructed, I think, back in 2008 timeframe, so it's been a few years since completion of the project. We had the opportunity, the fortune to work with Don Anderson from Pierce County from a regulatory standpoint, proactively in our revision review process. So in this case, this is a public project, so for us, a public client. The project, as you can see, we did a bunch of things here which were somewhat creative. Obviously recreational areas, because we're in a park setting. We have large contiguous open space areas that we stayed away from. I think about 65% overall the project site we tried to leave fallow in the condition. You can also see there's a lot of paved surface in here for parking and for access and for the recreational areas such as tennis courts. So as much as this is a park, it is not necessarily a pervious project by nature. The other thing that was critical about this project, there was significant topography in many of the areas on the project. This was not a flat site to start with, nor were all the soils great soils to work with. This is the rural Gig Harbor, unincorporated area of Pierce County. So this inventory slide, people have already somewhat spoken to this today, but you can see we have wetland areas, wetland buffer areas, aquifer recharge areas, a 5-year flood zone. We have slopes exceeding 20%, and a bunch of existing forests we tried to have remain. So in our projects, what we normally do is we put together a constraint map like this, basically overlaying all those constraints onto a series of sheets, if you will, or in this case, a combined drawing. And that's where we start with the client, go through the programming needs, in this case with Pierce County, and from that point try to develop a project which would meet the goals of the program, but also would work with the existing constraints we have to deal with. So a couple things were said earlier about the preparation for these projects. I think the gentleman from Redmond had asked about stormwater studies, how necessary are they up front in terms of LID. When we take a look at low impact development projects, obviously the geotechnical engineer is pretty critical to the project. We want to make sure that study is done not using gradation of soils, but actual pilot infiltration tests, actual field work to make sure we understand how the soils are going to perform. We want, in most cases, a real survey as opposed to an aerial survey that might be off some 2-3 feet. We want to make sure we have real information of what we're dealing with. In this case, making sure all the wetlands are delineated, all the buffers are delineated. So we have a clear indication of horizontally and vertically where to start on the project. And after we've identified all those areas, we can move forward and generate preliminary site plans, preliminary grading and drainage. This site plan gives you a little better idea of some of the ways that the topography is moving and how that relates to some of the program. We had parking areas which were adjacent to fairly steep slopes, so some of that was run off into bioretention areas. We had other areas, for instance, up here, we're trying to leave open space. And this is a fairly conceptual drawing, but we start there in terms of the program needs and then essentially work our way into more of a detailed, I would almost call it a preliminary drawing as opposed to a concept drawing in terms of grading and drainage, so that when we go to the agency or agencies, stakeholders, and we begin that collaboration, regardless of it's a public or private project, we have real information to present and discuss. You know, you've heard the old garbage in, garbage out. And so if you, as a project, present information that has some reality to it, I think you have a better result in terms of the collaboration with the jurisdiction when it comes to coming up with a set of solutions that meets everybody's needs. I think the other thing is, at those preliminary meetings, you also eliminate the fatal flaws. You eliminate the BMPs that aren't acceptable to the jurisdiction, aren't acceptable to the applicant stakeholder, and try to whittle things down to a set of criteria that everybody has buy-in to before you move that design forward. So everything went pretty well, but there are some lessons learned, and we had 4 bioretention areas within the project, and again, as was mentioned earlier, bioretention areas need to be engineered by a professional engineer registered in the state of Washington. And as opposed to utilizing a stormwater control manhole or a less aesthetic type facility, we opted in this case to have a weir system for discharge into our bioretention areas. And with the weir system, we came up with an outlet control weir notch for each of those. That was a much more aesthetic discharge to use, and from a maintenance standpoint, somewhat easier, although we actually collaborated with the county and the contractor to come up with a detail to essentially protect that inlet so it wouldn't get clogged with leaves and debris, etc. So a little bit of a lesson learned. The weir was a great idea, but again, we found some modifications during the process were necessary to perfect that, and so we still think, though, that was a much more aesthetic solution, and in that case, than having 4 control manholes. We also, on this project, had pervious paving. So we have a pervious paving section detail here, and what we essentially have is asphalt in the aisle, and we have pervious paving on the edge. Originally, the intent was to try to get this paving to flow off, but we had such steep slopes we couldn't do that, so we had to modify the concept on this. The other thing we did is we put essentially underground check dams perpendicular to this aisleway, which allowed us to not only have a area for the water to drain through the permeable paving, but also extended that to a larger underground reservoir for the purpose of infiltration of the stormwater. So that was a fairly creative thing that was done. But again, the idea was to slow the flow down. So as we had flow moving this direction underground, we would get enough stoppage there with the check dams to get the infiltration into the ground that we needed. So in closing, I would just like to reiterate that it does pay to start early with the stakeholders, with your client, with your jurisdiction, whatever the process is, with your internal team if it's a public project. And then document your design process, because when we have new technology where one side or the other is learning this technology as you go through the review process, the more documented you are, the easier it is to reflect back to the decisions that were made. Most of our sites, as I mentioned before, all the good sites are gone. Probably not all of them, but a lot of them are difficult today. So again, make sure you go out and do the due diligence you need to do. If you skimp on the due diligence piece, you might find yourself in kind of a do loop in terms of the review process. And last thing I'll say is LID alone may not always be sufficient for the purpose of stormwater control. We've had some projects where we introduced LID, but we still had smaller detention facilities downstream. But again, it was much more reduced than it would have been if we would have had one facility. Thank you very much.